In this video, I'm going to share a portion of my book collection as it relates to vintage hi-fi equipment servicing. I've only been doing this as a full-time hobby for about 3 years now, and in that period of time I've been trying to learn as much as I can, as quickly as I can, which led me to purchase a whole bunch of books. So in this video, I will tell you what the title of the book is, I'll explain what I like about it, I'll show you the table of contents, and I'll also explain where you can find it if you're interested in purchasing it. Some of these are available online for free as ebooks or PDFs, but some of them you have to find used, and others are available new. So if that sounds interesting to you, stick around. Alright, I'm going to start this off with my absolute favorite book. I wish I had this on day one when I started working on vintage hi-fi equipment. It's called The Theory and Servicing of AM, FM, and FM Stereo Receivers. This covers everything you need to know about a vacuum tube or solid-state receiver. Basic electrical theory, tools, troubleshooting, vacuum tubes, transistors, diodes, and most importantly, it covers FM and AM radio theory, servicing, and alignment. That was the one that led me to this book. I was having a hard time learning tuner alignments, and I wanted to deep dive into the theory a bit more. I don't remember how I found out about this book, but once I did, I was very happy to buy it. The one on the left is the first edition. The one on the right is the second edition. They're basically the same thing. The one on the left seems to have slightly more information on vacuum tube equipment than the one on the right. The one on the left was from the early 80s, and the one on the right was from the mid 80s. But I spent some time, digging through the table of contents, and it really seems like they're almost identical. The information might just be shuffled around a little bit. Okay, here's the table of contents from the first edition, and this was published in 1980. Here's the table of contents from the second edition, which was published in 1987. So you'll see that the books start out talking about high-level theory. They talk about active devices, transistors, vacuum tubes, diodes. They talk about power supplies, they discuss biasing, talk about the different audio amplifier topologies, talk about RF circuits, frequency changers, talk about the super heterodyne theory, talk about AM. They go through and explain some example AM receivers. They talk about troubleshooting. This one's pretty cool. They talk about different failure mechanisms and things like that. Basic troubleshooting AM. Then this is the main reason I wanted this book, was the principles of FM. So they talk about all the theory behind FM radio, how it works, and most importantly, they talk about FM stereo, which there's information on it on the internet, but this is much more comprehensive. It's a really great book if you want to learn FM stereo, understand how it works, and also talks about doing the alignments of it. Now, the downside to these books is that they're out of print and they're very expensive when you find them for sale used. And to make things even worse, they are not available in any form of ebook. So you have to buy them. You have to buy them used. I'd say they go from about $60 to $120 normally. So if you see them for sale for like $200, which happens from time to time on some of the used book sites, just wait. You'll find them on eBay eventually. People list them. So this next book is from 1974, and it's called FM Stereo / Quad Receiver Servicing Manual. And I actually didn't look for this one in particular, but it came up in a list of results on one of the used book sites while I was looking for another book, and it was only a couple dollars, so I figured I'd pick it up. And it's actually a pretty nice book. It's a pretty small book, but it's similar to the Theory and Servicing book we just covered, where it talks about some of the theory behind amplifiers. In this case, they're focusing on quadraphonic amplifiers because that was all the rage back in 1974. But all of this information still applies to regular stereo receivers. And again, they talk about tuners, which is good. It's rare to find that in a book. So there's our table of contents. They talk about AM receivers, power supplies. Talk about measurements, which is cool. I don't believe they talk about measurements in the last book. They talk about your total harmonic distortion, stereo channel separation, receiver measurements. So this is a decent book. It's cheap, like I said, or at least it was cheap when I found it. I think I paid like $10 for it. So if you can pick it up and you don't want to drop the big bucks on one of those other ones, this is definitely a good find. And I just checked, and it looks like this book is available as an ebook on the archive.org website. So if you Google it, you should be able to find it for free. This next book is from 1960, and it's called FM Simplified. And this was listed as a reference in the earlier troubleshooting, the theory and servicing of AM/FM stereo receivers. So they got some of their information in that book out of here. And this is from 1960, so it covers FM, but it does not cover FM stereo. It was right before FM stereo really got popular. And this is just a good book about vacuum tube FM in particular. So if you're looking to work on FM radios that are vacuum tube based, this would be a good starting book. It also talks about FM transmitters, which aren't of interest to me, but sometimes it's interesting to understand the other side of the equation. Here's a list of here's the table of contents. Zoom in a little. It looks like you can get some editions of this book online as a PDF. This is the third edition, which was the last one they released. The earlier ones look like they're available. I see a link to the second edition. I'm not sure if you can get the third edition as a PDF, but it might be worth searching. This next book is called Frequency Modulation Receivers, and this was also listed as a referencing in the theory and servicing books we talked about earlier. This one is a really good-sized book, and it really does a deep dive on FM. This one's a bit newer than the last FM Simplified book that we talked about, so it does cover FM stereo. Let's see what year this is from. This is from 1968, so let's take a look at the table of contents. I really wanted to show you guys the table of contents because some of these books, you couldn't even find a preview of that online, so I thought this might help with your decision to purchase these. Now, my favorite part of this book is there's a whole section on tuning indicators based on Magic Eye vacuum tubes. They basically give you a circuit description and example for just about every popular tube that was used back then. Let's see here, we're talking about the 6AF6, 6AL7, DM70. I thought that was really cool. 6BR8 or the EM80. I think that might be what's in my MR74. I don't recall. So, pretty neat book. Talk about neon bulb tuning indicators. Again, heavily focused on vacuum tubes. In this book, I could not find an ebook online, so it looks like you would have to purchase a used copy. Okay, this next book, this is a modern book, so this is still available new. It's Valve Amplifiers, the 4th edition by Morgan Jones. I think this is from 2012 or so. Yeah, it's from 2012. And this is a great book for all things vacuum tube, preamplifier, and amplifier related. Also talks about some solid-state electronics. Here's a view of the table of contents. Talk about circuit analysis, the basic building blocks, dynamic range distortion and noise. They talk about different types of capacitors, inductors, resistors. Talk about noise. Go over some power amplifier topologies, the different stages, preamp, RIAA section. It's a really great reference book. It's a pretty good sized book. It's almost 700 pages long. So if you wanted one book to get on vacuum tube amplifiers, I would probably pick this one up. Yeah, this next book is also a modern book that you can still buy new. This is written by Merlin Blencowe. He has the website valvewizard.co.uk. You might have read some articles there before. There's definitely some excerpts and things like that from this book on his website that you can read for free. and it's called Designing Power Supplies for Tube Amplifiers. It's a pretty small book. Let's see here, it's about just under 300 pages, but it's an absolute deep dive into all things power supply related for tube amplifiers. So if you're interested in understanding how tube amplifiers work or how to improve them, then this is the book for you. And here's a view of the table of contents. They cover mains power, cover rectification, voltage multipliers, smoothing filters, fusing, switching, and other refinements, regulators, series stabilizers and regulators, bias supplies, heater supplies. There's a lot of cool techniques in there on having low noise heater supplies for your tubes, and voltage control. So this is a great book. You can buy it new from his website. And we have another book from Merlin, Designing High-Fidelity Tube Preamps. Again, this is a new book that you would purchase from him. This is a much thicker book. It's about a little over 400 pages. And this covers everything you could ever need to know about designing a tube preamp. And it starts with the basics, essential electronics. So there's a lot of theory in there. Talk about components. What I like about this one is that there's a real deep dive into the different types of resistors, metal film versus carbon comp versus wire wound, when you'd want to use them. They also do a really good deep dive into capacitors, including the different characteristics of capacitors, such as noise. So then we have a fundamentals of application chapter, talk about your load lines and distortion and things like that. Talk about different types of tubes like the pentode. There's a section on noise. There's a lot of information on low distortion design in this book. There's a whole section on the RIAA phono stage. There's a section on power supplies, which actually has a lot of information from the last book that we showed. So if you're not sure, I'd maybe start out with this one book before purchasing the other one. Okay, and this comment here in his book is a good segue into my next section of books. He says, yes, there are hundreds of electronics textbooks from the 50s and 60s that can be bought for next to nothing nowadays. Well, I don't know that I necessarily agree with that part. All of which cover formal valve circuit theory to a higher standard than I ever could. So, on that topic, let's get into some older books. Okay, we've got the RCA Receiving Tube Manual. I do believe this one's available online as a PDF. There's also reprints of it available. You can get these at Hamfest sometimes cheap, but on eBay for some reason they seem to go for quite a bit of money. And this book's cool because there's a whole section up front talking about the different theory behind the uses of the different tubes. There's also a section in the back with all sorts of example circuits. The example circuits are pretty neat, but a lot of them talk about using really rare, strange, low production tubes that RCA made at the time. In the middle of the book is all your valve data, so all your tube data, characteristic curves, and things like that. This book is probably the only one you need for working on, 50s and 60s tube amplifier related stuff. There are some tubes that aren't in there, so you might need some other ones, maybe like a Sylvania book, or just honestly just look up the tube data sheets online in this day and age. But this is just a great book to have on hand. All right, and this next book, this is probably my second favorite book in the collection after the Theory and Servicing book that we covered first. And this is the Audio Cyclopedia 2nd edition by Howard Tremaine from Sam's Publishing. It's important that you get the 2nd edition. The 1st edition is from the 50s, and I think it's missing a lot of good information because there was such rapid change between the 50s and the 60s. And then there's the 3rd edition, which came out after this one, but from what I understand, it's a completely different book altogether. They don't talk about nearly as much technical detail as this one. Let's see here. What was the date on this? So this is from 1969. And this book is massive. It's, let's see, how many pages is it? Just under 1,800 pages. What I like about this book is it gives you a really good historical perspective on a lot of the early hi-fi, and you'll see something in modern equipment or modern test equipment, and you wonder, what the history behind it was. And well, this book explains all of that, and it's in a pretty cool format. It basically is in format of, I guess, an encyclopedia. So the questions are, what is? And you just spend hours paging through this thing and going down rabbit holes. And let's see, what's the table of contents? So there's a lot of things that I'm not interested in. There's a lot of professional audio stuff. There's a lot of information on like cutting heads and actually making, the other side of things, tape, microphones, film recording. But there's a lot of great information here on transformers, audio amplifiers. That's a big section. There's a whole bunch of information on speakers as well. And if you're interested in 50s and 60s hi-fi at all, they pretty much cover every big name item. The early Macintosh power amps, quad, I think is in here. And another cool section is the test equipment section, because they talk about all the early test equipment from the 50s and 60s. So, nowadays you get an audio analyzer, but back in the 50s and 60s, you would have had probably 3 or 4 instruments or more to do what you can do in a single instrument nowadays. So understanding, where some of that came from can be helpful in understanding how your new equipment works. So I would absolutely pick this up. There's a lot of schematics in here. There's a whole section on attenuators. This is available online as a PDF, by the way, but I just feel like you should have a physical copy of it because of the way you want to just thumb through it. Obviously, a lot of information on vacuum tubes and early solid state. Trying to find some of the amplifier diagrams in here. They talk about, this section that I happen to open up to talks about, the effects of underbiasing power amplifiers and showing you the transfer characteristic on the curve. It's just a really great book. This section here is talking about turntables, it looks like. Cutting heads, not so interested in that. They talk about some of the different cartridges. There's a Shure V15-2. Let's see here. Not into the film. A lot of film information. Okay, loudspeakers, yeah, pretty neat section. Let's find the audio. I might have already passed the audio amplifier section. Whole section on power supplies. They talk about lab power supplies. They talk about power supplies you would use in your equipment. There's a Heathkit IP20. I got a schematic here from my Kepco power supply. Test equipment. There's a lot of HP test equipment covered in here. Genrad. Distortion measurements using test equipment from the era. Yeah, I passed the audio section. I don't remember where it was. Oh, it's right closer to the beginning. So the format of this is really cool. Talk about frequency response. And there's a Macintosh MC40 schematic. They do a deep dive. Yeah, I think one of the, here it is. Describe the Macintosh amplifier circuit. So they do a deep dive on the MC40. There's an MC275. They talk about the Macintosh transformers. So it's a really, really cool book. There's a C24 preamp. They do a deep dive on the preamp. Here's another one. Describe a Williamson circuit using ultralinear operations. So, a lot of the Heathkits and different amps from the 50s and 60s were based on the Williamson design. So if you want to know anything about that, that is covered in here. So, yeah, knock yourself out. This is an awesome book. Okay, the next book is called the Radiotron Designer's Handbook, and I'll be honest with you, I picked this up at a Hamfest a few months ago, and I have not gone through it yet, but this is something that all of the old-timers say is like the reference on tube amplification, so I figured I'd grab a copy of it. So we'll just take a look at the table of contents. And again, this is a massive book. This was by RCA, or was it published by RCA? I think it might have been written by someone else, obviously a whole group of people. This is 1,500 pages, and here's the table of contents. Let me actually zoom in a little bit here so you can get a better view at it. I'm just going to page through these and not read any of it off. Zoomed in a little too far. This book is definitely heavy on the theory and math, so it's not a light read. Tone control. And you can pick this book up at Hamfest pretty cheap, under $20. You can also find them on eBay pretty cheap, and it's probably available as a PDF. I didn't even look. They also cover radio, so hence the Radiotron Designer Handbook. A lot of amplifier information, but also a lot of radio information, just tube information in general. Okay, here's another book on tube amps from 1956. It's called High-Fidelity Circuit Design by Norman Crowhurst and George Fletcher Cooper. This is another book I picked up recently. I haven't really gone through it yet, so we'll just go through the table of contents again. Actually, this is the second edition from 1957. So there's a section on feedback. There's a section on the design, which talks about the different, stages of the amplifier, power supply, attenuators, filters and equalizers. And they talk a lot about phase shift testing and talk about phase shift in general in this book. Some information on speaker systems, tone control circuits, interstage transformers, which you don't really see much, even on older equipment like that. Then there's a section on test equipment, and I thought this was kind of funny, improving old amplifiers, and keeping in mind this is from 1956, 1957, so yeah, I'm planning on going through this at some point, but I figured I'd at least mention it. This book's only available as an ebook. It's the Audio Precision Audio Measurement Handbook by Bob Metzler. There actually is a print version of this from the early 90s, but this is the second edition, and it was only released as an ebook. And let's see, so the first edition was 1993, and this one was PDF version in January 2005. And this is a great book if you want to do any sort of testing of your audio equipment with test equipment. And the cool thing about it is it's not specific to audio precision. They actually don't mention audio precision anywhere in the book. They just talk about the different tools you need and how to use them and how to get good test results out of them. So if you're interested, this is THD, signal to noise, IMD, phase measurement, just about everything you could ever think about. This is a really great book, pretty much a must-read, honestly. And there's a section in here that talks about cabling as well, on how to connect your audio analyzer. I'm actually going to be redoing the cabling to mine soon after reading this section. Okay, this is the section I was looking for. So I'm going to have to create some new cables for my analyzer to potentially improve measurements like signal to noise ratio. So again, great reference if you're into measurements. So this next book came out of a post that I had made in a group of audio technicians asking for any suggestions on books to purchase, to read and learn more. This is Troubleshooting Analog Circuits by Bob Pease. This is apparently a collection of articles that he wrote for the EDN magazine back in the 80s and 90s. And it is probably, 200 pages? Okay, yeah, just under 200 pages long. And it's just random blurbs about troubleshooting analog circuits. The philosophy of troubleshooting, there's 14 pages on that. That's great. He talks about what type of test equipment you really should have. Resistor problems, capacitor problems, diode problems. He talks about diode noise, transistor problems. There's a whole section on op amps, which is great. And yeah, it's just a great read. Found some useful information in here. I'm not sure if this one is available online as a PDF. It might be. I didn't look. So, only a 1-page long table of contents in this book. Okay, and this next book is Tektronix book. It's Semiconductor Device Measurements, and where this book comes in handy is if you own a curve tracer like a Tektronix 575 or 576 or 577. This book seems to feature the 576 the most. So if you want to, if you have a curve tracer and you're interested in understanding more of the theory behind transistors, FETs, diodes, and things like that, beyond what you can get out of one of those little Chinese component testers, this is a great book to read. This is available online as a PDF. I bought it from the Vintage Tech Museum. They have old tech books on their eBay site from time to time, so I wanted a hard copy of it. And this is from November 1969. And here's a look at the table of contents. So the first section is about bipolar transistors. Chapter 2 is about FETs. They cover a couple other types of transistors here, like unijunction transistors, SCRs, section on signal diodes, Zener diodes, tunnel diodes. So just another good reference book. These last few books I'm going to breeze through. I'm not into designing my own equipment yet, but I thought it would be helpful to have books that cover design so I can, use them as a reference when I run into a portion of a circuit that I don't understand and things like that. And both of the Douglas Self books, the small signal audio design and the audio power amplifier design, come highly recommended. So we'll take a look at the table of contents here. I'm pretty sure there's other people that have done an actual book review on these or more of a deep dive on YouTube. So the preamplifier design book obviously is heavy on low noise design. They cover a lot of the basics, different types of components. Sorry, let me move this over a little. Talk about discrete transistors, op amps, filters, different preamp architectures, gain stages. There's a very large section on moving magnet, phono, and RAA equalization. Another pretty good sized section on MC, phono amplifiers, tape, guitar preamps, volume control, balance control, tone control, mixers, microphone preamps, line ins, line outs, headphone amps, and then there's a bunch on signal switching, more on mixers, level indicators. A lot of this is also, pro audio or studio focused, which I'm not really that interested in at this point in time. Section on power supplies. A lot of it seems to be with creating power supplies for op-amp based equipment. And there's a small section on digital. All right, and the next book, also by Douglas Self, is the Audio Power Amplifier Design. And I forgot to mention on the last book, the Small Signal Audio Design. That's the 3rd edition. I believe there's a new 4th edition that came out last year. Take a look at the table of contents here. So this is, again, focused on power amplifiers. So there's some history and basics on them. Whole section on distortion, different types of distortion caused by different types of resistors, the feedback network. Whole section on negative feedback. A great section on amplifier classes. They talk about bridging. That was a section that I found useful when I first ran into some bridged quadraphonic amplifiers like a Marantz 4230, and I didn't quite understand what was going on there. So understanding, the bridge tied loads, this book definitely helped me there. I also had a audio control architect amplifier. I think that might have been a Class G or a Class H, I don't remember. So it was a nice reference to learn a bit more about how that worked. They talk about the general principles, the different distortions and different points there, input stage, the voltage amplifier stage. That's the one thing that's good about this book. It breaks down some examples of a power amp, showing you the different stages and explaining the components of each of those. We talk about push-pull amplifier, the output stage distortion. There's a real deep dive into the distortion. There's a lot of measurements in here as well. More distortion. Give you some examples of amplifiers, amplifier stability, output networks and effects of different loads on the amplifiers, cable impedance effects, reactive loads, resistive loads, slew rate, power dissipation, section on Class A, and there's a section on each type of amplifier topology there. Class G, Class D, FETs versus BJTs, thermal compensation, DC servos, protection circuits. This is also a helpful section I've found when troubleshooting vintage equipment, just getting a better understanding of how protection circuits work. Section on layout, grounding, and cooling. Power supplies, input systems, input processing, different types of things like subsonic filtering, ultrasonic filtering, testing and safety. This is more for people that are into like manufacturing. Still interesting to read. And this section is pretty cool too. This is a brief history of solid-state power amplifiers. Now, this guy's from the UK, I believe, so it's kind of more UK focused than what we would have here in the States, but it's still a good historical reference. Okay, and the next book is the Designing Audio Power Amplifiers, second edition by Bob Cordell. This is very similar to the Douglas Self book. I believe Bob Cordell is also based out of the UK. I forget, I think he might have worked for, was it Cambridge Audio? I don't recall. Maybe that was the other guy, Douglas Self. This is very similar. Audio Power Amp Basics. Talks about the different types of active devices. Design evolution. Building an amp. Noise. Negative feedback and slew rate. Evaluating stability. Talk about the different classes. Doesn't go into as much detail as Douglas Self's book, but they're there. Design considerations, power supply sizing, heat sink sizing, things like that. And it talks about the different stages again, the voltage amplification stage, DC servos. A lot of information on distortion. So it's basically very similar to the Douglas Self book. It's just a different take on it. So I like both of these books equally. Different types of clipping. This one talks about splice simulation, which is pretty neat. So if you're into LT Spice or whatever that new one's called that came out by that other company, you might like this section. There's a section here on distortion measurement. They talk about getting your dummy load set up, different test gear. Talk about some of the PC-based test gear. All right, a lot of information on feedback in this book. Another section on bridged amplifiers. They also talk about balanced. I found the balanced section helpful. I was working on a NAT symmetrical preamp a few months ago, fully balanced tube preamp, and I hadn't really worked on any balance gear before, so this book was helpful when I was trying to learn a bit more about that. All right, and the last book, of course, is The Art of Electronics. Everyone that's into electronics, tinkering or repair or design, pretty much have to have this book. Still available. This is a fairly recent edition. They even talk about Arduino and things like that in it. I have just flipped through this one and read a lot of the introduction. I haven't gone too far past the analog and the passive components and transistors, FETs, and op amps. There's a lot of information on digital in here as well. And I'm not going to say much about this book because there's other people that have definitely written actual reviews on this with more information than I could provide. Let's take a look at the table of contents here. So it starts off with, sorry about that. It starts off with the foundation. Then you go into transistors, FETs, op amps. And they start talking about precision op amps and things like that. But for what I'm interested in, vintage hi-fi equipment repair, it's really the first section of the book. There's also some sections on filters which are helpful. oscillators, low noise. So yeah, so pretty much up to chapter 9, and beyond that, that's when you start getting into digital. There is a section on test equipment towards the back of the book somewhere. Yeah, they talk about your load lines. Let's see here. Yeah, they tell you how to use an oscilloscope, things like that. So it's definitely a great book to pick up and have around as a reference. Okay, and the last book is the add-on to the Art of Electronics. It's called the Art of Electronics, the X Chapters. I'm trying to remember why I bought this. There was one specific topic I was interested in. So this just is deep dives into some of the topics in the Art of Electronics, and it tells you in the Art of Electronics which section it is here. I think I was interested in the resistors section, noise and temperature coefficients and inductance. There's also a deep dive on capacitor ESR, and you'll hear that mentioned a lot when it comes to repairing vintage equipment. So just another reference to have about current mirrors with BJTs. We talk about Zener diode noise in here. And I'll close this out with one book that I do not recommend purchasing. The upside of purchasing this book is that you'll have a much lighter wallet and maybe less back pain. HP catalogs, they're really cool to look through, learn all about the different instrumentation they had. This is the 1989 edition, which I find is a really, really great edition. It's just fun to read about the different test equipment and the things that you probably never even heard of. But like I said, it's going to lighten your wallet, so if you don't want your shop to look like this, stay away. So that's all I've got for this video. One thing I would like to ask people is if you have any books that I didn't cover here that you find could be helpful to continuing to learn this, I'm all ears. I'd love to learn more. There's other books that people will mention. They'll mention the ARRL ham radio books. I have all 3 of those as well, since I have my extra license. And they're not bad for basic electronic theory. They actually do cover a lot of the types of components that are used in audio as well. So you could definitely go that route as well. Another one that I've heard people mention is the Navy apparently had a series of documents called the NEETS, N-E-E-T-S. I think it was like Navy Electrical Engineering Technical School. So that's another commonly recommended source of information.